The tolling bells are a death knell for history itself. Across airwaves and screens, a sterile bulletin cracks the world's composure. Pope Francis XXIV is dead. But this is no ordinary passing. The name hangs heavy in the sudden silence. Petrus Romanus. He was the last pope. Not merely a title, but the grim fulcrum of a 12th century prophecy attributed to Saint Malachy, a whispered curse etched onto the scroll of time, that after Petrus Romanus, the seat of Peter would lie vacant amidst the ruins of Rome. Centuries of theological dread, dismissed as superstition by skeptics, calcified as truth by believers, crystallize in this single devastating moment. The somber chimes echoing over a hollowed Vatican aren't just mourning a man, they're the funeral dirge for an unbroken 2,000-year lineage. Imagine the crushing weight. Echoing footsteps alone traverse the cavernous, darkened expanse of St. Peter's Basilica, its grandeur now a sepulchre. Beneath the vaulted ceilings, where faith once soared, only a chilling chorus remains, the prophecy itself, a ghostly susurration in Latin, Greek, Aramaic, 1,000 tongues hissing its finality, growing from a murmur in the shadows to a roaring gale of impending doom. The chair of St. Peter isn't merely empty, it's a void screaming into the abyss of institutional collapse. This is the terrifying pivot point where faith collides with fatalism. Analysis chills the bone. The prophecy's power lies not in divine mandate, perhaps, but in its psychic hold. For generations it festered in the subconscious of the Church, a latent virus activated by this specific death. The critical question shifts with terrifying urgency. It's no longer if the Vatican, that sovereign citadel of spiritual and temporal power, will fall. The death of the last pope is the detonation. The haunting, inescapable question clawing at the mind is how? How does the unthinkable unfold? Does the machinery of conclave seize, paralyzed by sacred terror? Do cardinals, gripped by eschatological panic, fracture into warring camps, each clutching shards of doctrine, birthing rival popes in a grotesque parody of unity? Or does the sheer, paralyzing weight of the prophecy enforce a permanent vacant? See, an eternal interregnum where the gates of hell, metaphorically or otherwise, finally prevail. The dread isn't just in the event, it's in the agonizing anticipation of the schisms, the power vacuums, the global spiritual chaos poised to erupt from this sacred silence. The whisper has become the roar, and the foundations of the ancient world tremble on the edge of oblivion. The sacred machinery of succession, oiled by 2 millennia of ritual, seized with a chokehold of dread the moment the cardinals crossed the threshold. Within the hallowed, suffocating silence of the Vatican's inner sanctum, grief was a secondary tremor beneath the seismic weight of prophecy. Petrus Romanus was dead. His chair wasn't just empty, it radiated a terrifying vacancy that seemed to leach the certainty from the very stones of St. Peter's. The customary rites, the murmured prayers, the rustle of crimson silk, felt like hollow pantomimes performed over an open grave. Whispers slithered through the shadows, not of policy but of paralyzing doubt. The prophecy. It can't be true. Can it? The question hung, poisonous, in the air. Analysis reveals the core terror. This wasn't merely an election. It was a confrontation with an existential veto seemingly issued by God himself. The ancient protocols demanded a conclave, a sacred duty. Yet the chilling words of Malachy, fulfilled with terrifying precision by the death of the last pope, screamed that electing any successor was an act of blasphemous defiance against divine decree. The fracture was immediate, deep, and theological. Traditionalists, faces etched with rigid piety, became bulwarks of established law. The forms must be observed, they insisted. their voices tight with a fear masquerading as faith. To abandon the papacy was to abandon the rock upon which Christ built his church. Unthinkable apostasy. Yet opposing them stood the Reformists, pale but resolute, haunted eyes reflecting the prophetic void. Their argument was a terrifying syllogism of despair. The prophecy named him last. He is dead. Therefore the papacy ends. Perhaps God demanded not a new pope, they ventured, trembling yet defiant, but a radical return to a purer, popeless Christianity, a terrifying leap into an uncharted spiritual abyss. The listener hook claws at the psyche. What becomes of men ordained to channel divine will when they suspect that will has explicitly forbidden the very act they are gathered to perform? Can faith function when its central pillar is declared obsolete by a prophecy echoing through centuries? The tension, initially confined within the Vatican's gilded cage, erupted violently into the global consciousness, shattering any illusion of unity. Far from the paralyzed epicenter in Rome, the first cracks spiderwebbed across the world stage. In the fervent heart of Latin America, a charismatic archbishop, beloved by the masses weary of distant hierarchy, stood before a sea of rapt faces. His sermon wasn't one of mourning, but of shocking liberation. With fiery eloquence, he channeled the grassroots terror and hope swirling in the prophecy's wake. "Why grope for another earthly king," he thundered, "when the last has passed, as foretold? Does God reside only in Rome? Or does he call us now, in this hour of ending, to seek him directly heart to heart without the intercession of a throne declared empty forever?" His words were a match tossed into tinder. Simultaneously, from a Gothic stronghold in Europe, a hardened conservative cardinal issued a glacial decree. Dismissing the archbishop's dangerous mysticism and the reformers' cowardly heresy, he invoked canon law like a weapon. "The conclave will proceed," his statement declared, branding any doubt of the papacy's perpetual necessity as schismatic poison. This was the analysis made manifest. The Church wasn't just divided, it was actively weaponizing its own theology. The abstract conflict between tradition and prophecy exploded into a global war of words, broadcasted live. The rising action was viral and visceral. Online, digital trenches were dug overnight. Hashtags became battle cries. A new Reformation bloomed, advocating for decentralized faith, direct divine connection, echoing the Latin archbishop's call. True Church trended in furious opposition, a digital crusade demanding fealty to Rome's eternal structure, rallying behind the European cardinals' absolutism. In scattered parishes, small, fervent groups pledged allegiance to one banner or the other, whispering revolution or reciting rote condemnations over flickering candles. The sacred was becoming profane, splintered into 1,000 warring fragments broadcast on social feeds. The monolithic church was visibly crumbling from within, its fracture lines illuminated by the cold glare of smartphone screens. The conclave itself, convened under suffocating siege, both physical and metaphysical, became a grotesque theater of the absurd, a slow-motion suicide of tradition. Locked within Michelangelo's divine masterpiece, the Sistine Chapel, the cardinals were prisoners of ceremony and escalating dread. The frescoes of divine judgment seemed to leer down with cruel irony. Analysis dissects the paralysis. Fear wasn't just a factor, it was the presiding spirit. Traditionalist votes, cast with trembling hands, were met with stony prophetic refusal from reformists who saw each ballot as a nail in the church's coffin. Reformist arguments for radical change were drowned out by traditionalist shouts of "blasphemer" And heretic, accusations no longer whispered but hurled like stones, echoed under the painted heavens, corruption, cowardice, faithlessness. The deadlock was absolute, a theological and logistical nightmare. Days bled into weeks. The austere provisions dwindled. The air grew thick with desperation and the stale scent of trapped men and dying hope. The world outside watched, breathless, through a media lens, hungry for apocalypse. Then came the breaking point, as inevitable as it was catastrophic. Emaciated, eyes hollow with exhaustion and conviction, a critical block of reformist cardinals rose. One, a figure once known for quiet scholarship, now spoke with the terrifying clarity of absolute certainty. "We will not participate in this sacrilege." His voice cracked like a whip in the sacred silence. The prophecy is fulfilled. The Petrine ministry ends with Petrus Romanus. To elect another is to spit in the face of God's revealed will. The papacy is obsolete. The word hung monstrous in the air. Then, as one, they turned. The heavy doors of the Sistine Chapel, sealed for centuries by conclave law, groaned open. They walked out, not in secret, but in a deliberate, devastating procession of renunciation, past the stunned Swiss guard, into the blinding flashbulbs, and screaming questions of the global media throng. The listener hook isn't a question, it's a detonation. Live from Rome. Cardinals abandon conclave. Is this the end of the papacy? The locked doors stood open. The sacred process was ruptured. The fracture was now an irreparable chasm, and the Vatican's fall had begun not with a bang, but with the echoing footsteps of desertion beneath the painted eyes of a silent God. The schism wasn't gradual. It was a tectonic rupture, violently birthing rival realities where one universal truth had reigned. Cast out from Rome, the rebel reformist cardinals didn't retreat. They reconsecrated, gathering not in a gilded chapel but perhaps in the stark, sun-drenched piazza of Assisi, hallowed by Francis's embrace of poverty, now repurposed for revolution. They enacted a ceremony both ancient and shockingly novel. Analysis cuts deep. This was more than defiance. It was theological alchemy. They invoked the prophecy of the last pope, not as an ending, but as a liberation. Petrus Romanus's death, they declared, shattered the old monarchical model, fulfilling Malachy's words by ushering in the true age of the people of God. Their radical reinterpretation twisted centuries of canon law into a pretzel of necessity. With progressive theologians nodding grim approval and lay movements roaring assent, they placed the simple mitre on the head of their chosen figure, perhaps Pope Linus II, a name echoing apostolic roots while severing them from Peter's line. The sound design screamed dissonance. The timeless cadence of Latin liturgy collided with the amplified cheers of the crowd, the whir of news drones overhead replacing the whisper of votive candles. Ancient ritual met the almost secular fervor of a political rally, broadcast globally. This wasn't just a rival pope, it was the desecration of the papacy's very essence, reborn as a democratic heresy. Rome's response was a thunderclap of condemnation, shattering any lingering hope of reconciliation. Behind the still magnificent, now fortress-like walls of the Vatican, the remaining cardinals, purged of doubters, finally elected their champion, Pope Gregory XVIII. A staunch traditionalist, his first encyclical wasn't pastoral, it was a declaration of holy war. Analysis reveals the terrifying rigidity. Gregory didn't merely dismiss the Assisi claimant. He anathematized him, branding him the anti-pope of apostasy, a servant not of Christ but of chaos. The prophecy of Malachy, merely symbolic, Gregory proclaimed, a medieval metaphor misused by faithless fools to justify their treason. This denial wasn't theological nuance. It was a desperate bulwark against the void. Yet, the edict triggered the global schism in blood and ink. The fracture became geographic, visceral, and violent. Bishops agonized, swear fealty to Rome's ancient authority or Assisi's revolutionary spirit of the age. Entire religious orders splintered. Jesuits debated Jesuits, Franciscans condemned Franciscans. Dioceses declared independence or were summarily excommunicated by rival popes. Nations, calculating geopolitical advantage, scrambled for recognition. Secular powers now arbiters of sacred legitimacy. The chaos turned physical. Clashes erupted at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem as rival factions fought to control the sacred space. Processions turned into riots in Manila and Mexico City. The universal church was now a global battlefield, stained with the blood of believers convinced their side alone held salvation. Amidst the clamor of rival claims, a third voice arose. Not a shout, but a chilling, pervasive silence that seeped into the cracks of broken faith. This was the Vacante faction, coalescing in hushed university theology departments, austere monastic retreats, and online forums humming with apocalyptic mysticism. Their argument was a terrifying absolute. Both Rome and Assisi were tragically blasphemously wrong. Analysis unveils their puritanical logic. The prophecy was literal and irrevocable. Petrus Romanus was the last. Any attempt to elect a successor, whether draped in tradition or revolution, was a profound sin against God's declared will. The see must remain vacant, they insisted, not as a temporary setback, but as a permanent state, a divine mandate for an endless, purifying interregnum. This wasn't inactivity, it was an active, demanding asceticism of waiting. They gained traction, not through power, but through profound disillusionment, attracting souls sickened by the spectacle of rival popes, yearning for a faith stripped bare of corruptible human authority. Their gatherings were silent vigils, their altars deliberately empty, a haunting embodiment of the prophecy's void. And into this spiritual and institutional vacuum, sensing weakness like carrion birds, slithered the opportunists. From the polished studios of a Texas televangelist came booming declarations of new revelations. God, they claimed, had bypassed the corrupt cardinals entirely, anointing them as his true mouthpiece and steward of his earthly kingdom and its bank accounts. Analysis exposes the predatory calculus. This was faith monetized into oblivion, exploiting fear to siphon millions from the desperate and confused. Simultaneously, in the marble halls of an autocrat's palace, a secular predator moved. A strongman, leader, eyeing the Vatican's immense wealth and waning moral authority, offered himself as a neutral temporary steward, a protector of order. The proposal dripped with cynical realpolitik, dissolve the papal states anew, place assets under protective management, and position himself as the indispensable arbiter between the warring Christian factions. This wasn't faith, it was a naked power grab, wrapping itself in the tattered cloak of necessity. The opportunist, whether spiritual huckster or political predator, thrived in the murk, further poisoning the well of belief, diverting resources, and fracturing loyalties with promises of certainty in exchange for surrender. The listener hook isn't rhetorical, it's a dagger to the heart of faith. Three paths now yawn before a shattered Christendom. Two men in white, each claiming the keys of heaven from rival hills, their anathemas echoing like cannon fire. And a third, deeper call, not for a new pope but for an eternal, crushing silence where the throne of Peter gathers dust. Between the clamor of rivals and the void of the vacant see, opportunists circle, whispering sweet lies into the chaos. The most terrifying question isn't theological. It's personal, immediate, and utterly without an infallible answer. In this maelstrom of claims and counterclaims, of sacred silence and profane ambition, who do you believe? The descent isn't just institutional, it's the plummeting of countless souls into a labyrinth of doubt where every path promises truth and every choice might lead to damnation. The death of the last pope wasn't an end, but a detonator, plunging the world into spiritual and geopolitical freefall. The UN Security Council, accustomed to mediating wars over land or oil, now found itself a bewildered referee in a holy schism, its chambers echoing with absurd, high-stakes debates. Which claimant to God's throne deserves a seat at the table of nations? Analysis reveals the cold pragmatism beneath the sacred veneer. Nations weaponized papal recognition, aligning with Rome's Pope Gregory XVIII to appease conservative constituencies, or backing Assisi's Pope Linus II as a calculated snub to old-world influence. The Vatican City itself, that sovereign sliver of sanctity, became a prize fought over not just spiritually, but legally and physically. The Vacant See faction launched lawsuits claiming it as a perpetual monument to prophecy's silence. Opportunist regimes whispered of protecting its priceless treasures from the chaos they helped fuel. Its very sovereignty, predicated on the Pope's unquestioned authority, bled away as rival emissaries demanded keys to archives and vaults, turning St. Peter's Square into a tense no-man's land, patrolled by nervous Swiss guards facing inward as much as out. Socially, the fracture was catastrophic. Ordinary believers, once anchored by a universal church, were cast adrift in a tempest of doubt. Mass confusion curdled into mass exodus. Surges in conversions to Islam, Buddhism, or stark atheism became measurable trends, while extremist groups, frothing traditionalist militias vowing to purge heretics, and militant secularists gleefully dismantling the opiate's last gasp, filled the vacuum with violence and venom. Scandals, once contained whispers, erupted like septic wounds. Rival factions leaked decades of hidden corruption to discredit each other, turning the sacred into lurid tabloid fodder, further eroding the very concept of holy authority. Spiritually, the most agonizing questions were the simplest, echoing in a million confessionals now devoid of certainty. Father, is there a church? Is the Mass I attend valid if the priest follows that pope? Who has the power to forgive my sins? The focus wrenched violently inward. Local parishes became lifeboats or battlegrounds. Personal faith, a desperate, solitary lighthouse beam in a raging dark sea. A profound, terrifying intimacy born of institutional collapse. As the global structures trembled, the rival claimants fought not just for survival, but for the corpse of legacy itself. The propaganda war escalated into a grotesque archaeology of the sacred. Rome dispatched agents to secure relics, the bones of saints, slivers of the true cross, desperate to anchor Gregory's legitimacy in tangible holiness, while Assisi's faction broadcast rediscovered Gnostic texts or radical papal critiques, framing Linus II as the fulfillment of suppressed truth. Holy sites became strategic choke points. Jerusalem's ancient sanctuaries witnessed pitched battles between rival pilgrim gangs. Santiago de Compostela saw processions collide. The release of evidence, manipulated transcripts, dubious visions, damning financial records became weapons of mass spiritual disillusionment. The potential for catastrophic violence simmered, a pressure cooker threatening to explode. Then came the fall, not with celestial fire or barbarian hordes, but with a chilling symbolic finality that resonated deeper than any siege. Perhaps it was the day Swiss guards, ordered to defend Gregory against a surge of vacant see ascetics mixed with anti-religious protesters, lowered their halberds and stepped aside, allowing the mob to flood St. Peter's Basilica, not to destroy, but to occupy the hollowed heart, declaring it the people's sanctuary of silence. Or the night Gregory XVIII, his Roman faction bankrupt and besieged, fled the Vatican in an unmarked car, a modern-day Avignon in reverse, leaving behind only the echo of slammed doors. Maybe it was the headlines screaming across every screen. Vatican bank collapses, Holy See assets frozen globally. Or simply the weary pronouncement from a once revered news anchor. After 2,000 years, the Vatican experiment is over. The moment wasn't about physical destruction. It was the irreversible shattering of the idea, the instant the world collectively understood that the monolith had crumbled into irreconcilable dust. Years later, the dust settles, revealing not restoration, but a haunting, fragmented afterlife. The rival structures persist, but as pallid ghosts. Gregory XVIII's exiled court, holed up in a donated castle, issues decrees read only by a dwindling band of elderly loyalists, its grandeur decaying into a fortress of brittle nostalgia. Assisi's People's Church fractured further, Linus II, reduced to presiding over a loose network of social justice NGOs, the revolutionary fire dimmed to bureaucratic embers. The opportunists' empires, the televangelists' gilded compound, the autocrats' stewardship office, collapsed under the weight of scandal and the fickleness of fear-driven followers. Only the vacant see endures, strangely potent in its stark negation, their silent shrines, bare rooms facing an empty chair, candles illuminating nothing but absence, draw a steady stream of the disillusioned and the devoutly patient, keeping vigil for a divine sign that never comes, a permanent state of purgatorial waiting. The final focus sharpens not on the ruins of power, but on a defiant spark kindled in the ashes. In a neglected urban parish, perhaps, a former nun, stripped of her order by schism but not her faith, leads a small, vibrant community. There are no papal encyclicals here, no claims to universal authority. Analysis finds profound resonance here. Faith has shed its imperial skin, reduced to its raw communal essence. They feed the hungry, shelter the outcast, break bread together in remembrance, finding God not in a distant throne, but in the grit of shared struggle and radical compassion. The contrast is devastating. The decaying fortress versus the bustling soup kitchen, the echoing silence of the vacant sea shrine, versus the raucous, joyful singing of the community choir. The final narration isn't closure, it's an open wound. And a whispered challenge. The throne of Peter stands empty, a monument to prophecy's chilling weight. The Vatican, that luminous, terrifying engine of faith and empire for 2 millennia, has fallen. But gaze upon the ruins and see not just desolation. See 1,000 sparks igniting in the darkness, small, resilient communities clinging to love, mystics embracing the void, rebels forging new paths. Each spark is a fragile vessel of belief, a potential beacon, or a flickering candle leading deeper into the labyrinth. The prophecy ended an era with terrifying finality. What unfolds now is humanity's uncharted pilgrimage, a story without map, scripture, or shepherd. The most profound, terrifying question echoes not from Rome, but from within your own soul. In this wilderness of splintered certainty, where will your faith lead you? The silence after the fall isn't empty. It's deafening with possibility, pregnant with both salvation and oblivion, demanding an answer from every heart that ever sought the divine.